Hello and welcome to I Miss Book Club. I'm Veronica Reynolds and I'm welcoming back my sometimes co-host, Joe Barbieri. Thanks for joining me again, Joe.
Hi, glad to be here again.
So Joe and I are working on an episode where he will be telling me about something, which I'm looking forward to immensely because he's been so patient and listening to me tell him about things the past few episodes. But Joe is going to bring us I think we're saying like libraries in music, books in music videos. That's the next one that we're working on, which we're both looking forward to.
Yeah, I
But
think that'll be a fun one.
I do too. But for today's episode, we're going to bring you another author talk because I had reason to prepare one. Reason one being, I just really love this guy in particular. It's kind of amazing. It took me this long to put a talk together about him. I did take a semester class intensive just on Oscar Wilde, which is already crazy enough, but I was not an English major. This was just something that I wanted to do. So I have read pretty much everything he's ever written outside of some of the more esoteric magazine articles and things to that extent. I won't get too deep into his oeuvre today because I do like to cover the life of the author. I think that gets discussed a little bit less often. But before we begin, Joe, what do you know about Oscar Wilde? What's your Oscar Wilde exposure?
Okay, so for as big as like a proponent of the classics as I am, Oscar Wilde is a total blind spot, blank spot. Let's see, I know we are 19th century Irish poet and playwright. I think, and just kind of literary, in that literary world. I won't limit him to just. And that's really it. Picture of Dorian Gray, portrait of Dorian Gray.
Picture of Dorian Gray.
Okay,
it is picture. I always want to say portrait too, but it is picture.
But it is a portrait picture, right?
It's a portrait picture. Yes. Okay. Say that 10 times fast. It's a portrait picture. So you're absolutely nothing you said was wrong.
Okay, okay. So I'm in the ballpark.
Yeah, you got it. Victorian era, all of that good stuff. And him as an Irish writer is interesting because it's one of the reasons I picked him for it's March while we're recording, but I think the episode will probably go out in April. So I picked him because he is technically an Irish writer, and Ireland can definitely claim him as one of their own. But he did almost all of his famous writing while living in England and partially while being in France. And one of the most famous things about him, which you may appreciate as a appreciator of American history, is his American tour. So I'll tell you about his North American tour as well.
Okay.
So he's born in 1854. So we're pretty firmly in our 1800s era. It's kind of at the end-ish of the potato famine. So just for context, for anyone who's not aware, pretty bad situation that most historians would say the English pretty much caused to happen in Ireland that killed a lot of Irish people. The population in 1841 was 8.2 million, and by 1871, it's 5.4 million.
Wow.
Mostly deaths from the potato famine, although there is a lot of emigration at that point too, mostly to the US. That's when we see a big US boom of the Irish population. So during this point, we start seeing a secret society named the Irish Republicans who are forming to create an Irish Republic. And this would start to play out during Wilde's lifetime, although we would not see the hugest effects until we get a little bit later into the 20th century. Wilde himself, he descends from a long line of Irish people and some what they call Anglo-Irish, meaning they're English people who came over there. Sometimes you'll see debates about what makes an Irish author and the argument about if they're Anglo-Irish descended or Irish descended. He is both.
Okay.
He's partially descended from a Dutchman named Colonel de Wilde, who came to Ireland with King William of Orange in 1690, and also some local Irish bricklayers. So, a little bit of everything.
Okay.
His father is an interesting guy, Sir William Robert Wilde, becomes Ireland's leading ophthalmological surgeon. I can't say that, ear and eye surgeon. So he's in medicine. He is a big philanthropist. He's an all-around good dude, right? Except for the fact that he has 3 illegitimate children before his marriage, which I will get to momentarily because this is one of those things that I found out in the course of researching this. So talking about how easy it is to bury stuff historically. I'm sure something you've come across pretty frequently, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. From time to time, you come across those little secrets that people, everyone wants to chew under the rug.
Right. So he's actually knighted in 1864, not just for being a pretty great surgeon and medical advisor, but also because he plays this really important part in us in the censuses. Censi. How do you pluralize
I
census?
think it's censuses. Yeah.
Censuses. It doesn't sound right, but yeah, I think you're right. So censuses, because he really wanted to gather more information on the blind and deaf citizens of Ireland
Hmm.
specifically, but he wound up being a pretty big part of census gathering.
Okay.
Quick background on him. Uh, Wilde's mother, who was born Jane Elgie, is the daughter of an archdeacon. They're both father and mother are in the Church of Ireland. She's self-educated, and it's said that she can speak up to 10 languages before she's 18.
Okay. So it seems like in this family, there's some money and enough leisure time to take up these artsy
Correct.
philanthropic pursuits, right?
Right. So I would say that they are both solidly a part of the new middle class that's forming during the Victorian era.
Okay.
While his father's ultimately knighted, he doesn't start out as land owning gentry by any means.
Okay.
Um, and Jane is like this kind of daughter of the church, essentially not, again, of any particular elevated status, but certainly there's money lying around. And she's
Okay.
very educated, and she takes up a pen name, Speranza, and she starts publishing poems in. So we're going to talk about magazines a lot. I'm sure you're shocked because
Okay.
magazines are a big part of this era. Called The Nation, and
Okay.
she writes pro-Irish independence and anti-British material
Oh, okay.
to the point where her editor is brought to court and they're trying to make him reveal who Speranza is.
Ooh, okay.
And he defends Speranza, which of course is Lady Wilde, and takes responsibility and says it was me. And
Mm.
they ignore this because they don't believe it. And they shut down the magazine and it never
Oh,
publishes again.
wow.
So she goes on writing under that pen name. She's very well known, both then and I think historically now, for being a part of this pro-Irish movement and kind of its infancy. So she's in her over herself a figure, although not named. Those illegitimate kids. I'm just going to take a quick. It doesn't have anything to do with Wilde because it's not even clear that he knew the two girls existed. So he knew about his brother. He does have
Okay.
a half brother that his father is very fond of. He's raised by a cousin and ultimately becomes a doctor. But he dies very early. He dies at 39 of pneumonia with no heirs.
Mm.
Wilde never really talks about him, but there's no way Oscar Wilde didn't know about this guy. I don't know if he
Okay.
knew he was his half brother, but he knew he existed.
Mm.
But he has these two half sisters, Mary and Emily, and they're raised by relatives, which was very common, right? Because the father did support them. So Sir William does financially support them. He doesn't deny that they exist, but he does not
Yeah.
recognize them. And this is sad. So they're at a party in 1817, and Mary's dress catches fire.
Oh.
Emily, her sister, rushes to help her, and she's also quickly set ablaze. There
Oh.
is a lack of clarity on what happens directly after this, if anybody helped them, or if everybody fled, or if they ran out into the yard. They both die of their wounds within like a week of each other.
Mm.
And because they were illegitimate, Sir William hushes up their death. And so we just like don't know if Wilde ever even knew about this,
Wow.
that he had two sisters, if he knew
Yeah.
about them, if he knew about their death. And the reason I bring it up is because so he has two legitimate feels wrong, but two recognized siblings
Yeah.
between Sir William and Jane. So he has this older brother, William, who is called Willie everywhere. He doesn't this is very common around Wilde. I don't think he was doing it particular. Everyone has like a little nickname. So
Mm, okay. Willy Wild.
Willie Wilde studies. That must be why they called him that, right? Willie Wilde is a great name. Um, but Willie studies law. He goes on to become a journalist. He's not the only person like that. There's a couple people who study law in the story and become journalists. I think
Okay.
because there wasn't that much to study if you were like a middle income person. I think you could do like law and the clergy, right?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, those are probably some two major options. Yeah, so
And medicine,
much to,
maybe.
yeah.
So I don't think you'd like study to become a journalist
Yeah, that's true.
necessarily.
Yes, you can't stroll into a college university and pick up a,
Right. So
yeah, I got
Oscar and
that.
like Willie do not they get along in parts of their lives, but Willie is like a horrible alcoholic. Like, he really struggles with alcoholism.
Okay.
He gets married to this really rich woman and she divorces him almost immediately, like, absolutely not. He marries a younger woman, they have a child together. He dies before Oscar at the age of 46, complications of alcoholism. He famously, Oscar Wilde has this line about, like, relations being more tolerable after dinner, and everyone thinks that, like, he came up with it literally, like, the day after he saw his brother. Like, he just is
So,
not super fond of him towards the end of their lives, which isn't saying much because they all die so early. But
mm,
the reason I bring up the sisters, so Wilde has a sister that he does know who's his full sister. Her name is Isola Francesca Emily, and they're super close. She's like 3 years younger than him, and she's visiting a relative, gets sick extremely quickly, and dies at the age of 10.
uh,
And he's very affected by this for his whole life, but scholars didn't know how much until, like, really recently. It's one of these crazy things where they, like, found a notebook that no one had found before. You would think, like,
oh,
Wilde
that's
was, like,
exciting.
so
Yeah.
studied, right? But some scholar goes in, or maybe the notebook was already there and nobody read it previously or whatever. Um, but someone found it, and it's full of these, like, elegies, and, like, it's an early work of his, like, an early notebook, and, like, there's tons of poems to his sister.
Oh,
And when he dies, like, in his possession is this envelope that he must have decorated, like, pretty young, that's got, like, little pictures on it, and it's got a lock of her hair in it. Like, the envelope says,
mm,
"My Isola's hair." And, like, one of these weird things that comes up, like, in the elegies, like, people say, like, it almost sounds like he's taking responsibility for her death, and
mm.
no one really knows what to make of this because she died of illness, and he was not there. But I don't know, I think kids blame themselves for things that they don't really have control
Yeah,
over.
maybe it's some kind of weird survivor's guilt or yeah.
Right.
Hmm.
But you have this compounded thing of, like, he lost these half sisters that we don't even know if he knew he had,
Yeah,
and you just start to get this picture of this guy really, like, surrounded by death, with it, which, given his kind of lighthearted, ha-ha, jokey way, seems really, like,
yeah,
at
yeah.
odds. But I guess a lot of comedians have trauma, right? Like,
That's yeah. I mean, I think that's yeah. That's unfortunately that's where a lot of the best material comes from. I think.
right? So just to give you a taste, this was part of one of the elegy is, "Coffin board, heavy stone, lie on her breast. I vex my heart alone, she is at rest." This is, like, part of his elegy for his sister.
Mm,
So, that aside, he's born in Dublin, and he
okay.
grows up in Dublin in 1854. He's burned into the Church of Ireland, which I found these references to, that's why we don't know much about his very early life, and I was like, I don't know if that means that the records were lost or they were not kept. I'm not clear,
Mm,
because it was very odd like, fragmented sentence, and I couldn't find a collaboration on that, but, um, he's homeschooled, which would have been pretty typical. He had a French nanny and a German governess, so homeschool meaning there's, like, pretty educated people taking care of him,
yeah.
and they both teach him his languages. So he does know German. We know for a fact he's fluent in French because he does go to live in France. And he goes to, like, a late primary school, Patora Royal School, until 1871. So that's, like, his pre-college education. He already has, like, a big propensity for reading, and he really loves Greek and Roman classics, which of course would have been, like, a huge part of the education back then, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, Greek and Latin were kind of like it. That was your bog standard education stuff, but he was good at it. And just so you know what kind of wealth we're talking about, he was in private school during the year, and then he spent summers in the Villa Moitura house, which his father had bought in County Mayo. So they had a second country home. It
Okay. Yeah.
was out of the country. They didn't like Ville. They didn't summer in Italy or anything, but they did have a County Mayo summer house,
Yeah.
specifically in the town of Kong, but spelled with a C.
Yeah.
He wins a bunch of prizes for his Greek and Latin translations. And he winds up being one of only 3 students at the school. He wins the Royal School Scholarship to go to Trinity, which
Oh,
was
okay.
a college in Dublin, of course, at the time. So when I put together this presentation, rather than naming the slides like you normally do, I put wild quotes as the title of every slide. So I might share
Oh,
a
okay.
few of those. Because, like, he's
Sure.
really known for his one-liners. It's like one of his, like, most
Yeah. Yeah.
famous attributes, right? So here's one for you. Education is an admirable thing, but it is well to remember from time to time that nothing that is worth knowing can be taught. which is big words coming from a guy who'd got a lot of higher education for what the standards were at the time.
Yeah.
So while he's at Trinity, he's sharing rooms with his brother Willie. So one must imagine they're at least getting along well enough to live together at this point. Maybe he wasn't given a choice. I don't know.
Mm.
This is where I have to pause because I realize this is going to be the first allusion to this. Do you know how Wilde's life ended?
Well, I know he died very young, right? He
Mhm.
wasn't long lived. And I know you just alluded to the fact that he spent some time in France. I think he was in exile or something
Oh, okay.
of that
I'm so
sort,
excited
right?
that you don't know this because I think
Oh,
most of the
okay,
people
no.
I would talk to about this kind of know this already. So I'm going to give you a an illusion here, and you can start to put together some puzzle pieces, and we'll see if you get there before we get there.
Okay.
So his tutor. So just to be clear, I'm sure you're aware of this, but just in case, in UK colleges, they operate differently. Do you know about this?
Enlighten me, because
Okay. So rather than go to like a series of classes with a bunch of different professors, you do that, but rather than take assignments from them, you have like a course of study and there's like a person who oversees your studies. They're like a
okay,
tutor and you're really their student. So you'll go to like different people's lectures, but they're kind of overseeing your experience and they're the one you answer to. It's a slightly
okay.
different system. This was very in vogue back then. I don't know how true this is widespread, but I'm pretty sure Oxford at the very least still operates that way.
Mm.
So his tutor at Trinity was this guy named J.P. Mahaffey, and he was a really well-known classic scholar. And he would often brag about Oscar Wilde having been his pupil until later, until unnamed specified things. And then
Yeah.
he says that Wilde is the only blot on his career as a tutor.
Ooh.
Yeah. Um, Wilde also joins like the University Philosophical Society. He writes papers for them. He does really well. He wins the Berkeley Gold Medal in Greek, which is their highest academic achievement award. Um,
Okay.
he competes for like a half scholarship. They call it a demiship. I'd never heard of that term before.
Mm.
That at the time was worth £95, but with inflation, we're talking about $10,000 in today's money to go to Oxford,
Okay.
specifically Magdalen College in Oxford. 'Cause, Oxford's a lot of different colleges. So he goes to Oxford. So he's a real
Yeah.
dope.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's really this guy's a smarty pants.
Yeah.
And he gets to Oxford and he dabbles in a couple things, including Freemasonry,
Okay.
which he doesn't continue to pursue. He has his first dalliance, I would call it, with Catholicism, which he will have a unrequited love affair with the rest of his life. The Catholics don't want him. He wants to be Catholic. This is true
Yeah.
of his entire life. So you'll hear me bring it up again. But what really happens is that he becomes kind of the disciple of two different men, to varying degrees. One is William Pater, who writes studies in the history of the Renaissance, and Pater is beginning of the aesthetic movement. And Wilde really gets into the aesthetic movement, which is like just like surrounding yourself with beautiful things for the sake of beauty. Wilde decorates his room with peacock feathers, lilies, sunflowers, blue china, and objects to art. And here he has one of his first of his, what as they call them, epigrams, but I call one-liners. I find it harder and harder every day to live up to my blue china. So Pater's got this whole thing where like art is should be treated with humor and devotion and this love of beauty for beauty's sake.
Okay.
Wilde also at this time encounters John Ruskin, who's kind of in dialogue with Pater, and Ruskin really believes in art for the betterment of society. And while Wilde will wind up being a lot more like Pater, he really respects Ruskin a lot to the point where even though Wilde kind of prided himself on being the type of person who did not get up early and certainly did not do physical labor, he actually gets up very early in the morning along with a lot of other students and go to help Ruskin in this project where they plant flowers on country lanes just
Oh,
as a beautification project. So I like this because I think it shows the two sides of Wilde very well, where you have this kind of like funny dandy who's beautiful for beauty's sake, who's all about style, and
yeah.
there is this substance part of him underneath too.
Yeah.
I just like that story of him getting up early.
Yeah.
But this is when he starts to become a dandy,
Okay.
really. He
Because if you,
wrote
I
this.
mean, that's
Yeah.
what I would say. Like that the quote about the China makes a lot more sense. In my mind, knowing what I know, than the waking up early to plant
Plant
flowers for beauty's sake, and getting your hands real
real
dirty,
grimy, yeah.
literally.
So I won't inflict too many photos of you on you today, but 'Cause it's really just if you Google Oscar Wilde, like, the cool thing about him is he's born within the time where we do have photographs. So we just
Mhm.
have tons of pictures of him really not tons, but we have a great deal of photographic evidence of him, and you can just kind of watch his style evolve until he's he's clearly going for something. Like, there's literally a photo shoot of him. I might show you that picture where he takes a photo shoot when it comes to America. This Wilde thing happens. So Wilde starts writing articles and stuff, and he's kind of known. He goes back to Dublin after Oxford briefly. This woman that he was acquainted with and really liked, Florence Balcombe, who's I mentioned her by name for a reason. So he thinks he's going to get engaged to her. He really likes her, and she rejects him because she subsequently meets and marries Bram Stoker.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. We've got some great literary circles and Venn diagrams going on already.
Oh my god. So he's like again already like now and by all accounts Wilde like handled it pretty well, but he's like I'm leaving Ireland and I'm never coming back.
Okay.
And he almost does that. He only goes back to Ireland twice in the remaining years of his life and both visits are very brief.
Oh,
Like
okay.
he goes back to lecture. He
So
like
maybe this is like was I right in a way? Is this a self-imposed exile?
exile from Dublin anyway. Like,
Exile from Dublin.
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, nothing bad happened at this point. He's just like, forget it. I'm never coming back here. I mean, he's
Okay.
become enamored with England, right? Because he's achieved some success there. He's meeting a wider circle of people.
Okay.
Around this time, while he's in Oxford, his father dies. And because of that, even though he's not the firstborn son, so he doesn't get like the estate, but he gets the proceeds from selling some of his father's properties. So he uses that money to get himself set up in England. He, puts himself up in a boarding house, which wouldn't have been unusual. That wasn't like a low rent. He couldn't afford to have servants or something on his own that young. So this way he had someone making him food or whatever. It was a nice boarding house. And he meets this woman, Lily Langtry, who's like a style queen of the time. I'm gonna start throwing around, and I don't mean this in a way. I think people would take this as like, oh, it's insulting, but it's just I'm trying to think of modern equivalents. She's almost like a Kardashian.
Okay.
'Cause, like, everybody knows who she is. She's
Yeah.
famous pretty much for being a glamour queen. She's smart, she's very clever, but she's known for being, like, beautiful, essentially,
Okay.
and stylish. And they stay friends pretty much for the rest of their lives. She introduces him to everybody. He starts going to salons because of her, and his information sells. He finally publishes a book of poetry in 1877. He's been writing poems for a while. And he sold all his copies. He made 750 the press ran 750 copies all sold. It does
All
not
right.
get well reviewed, but they sell out, so who cares,
Okay.
right?
It sells.
He winds up having a second printing made because he's going to America.
Oh,
Now you
okay.
may say, "This guy's published a couple of articles and some poetry. How is he going to America?" Great question. He's hired to give 150 talks across the country.
Oh, wow. Okay. So he's got his calendar full.
Right, so he's gonna be talking about, like, Greek and Roman literature and, his aesthetic philosophy and all that. But again, he's not that old.
Yeah.
How
I
is
mean,
this
he's
happening?
what, like mid-20s now?
This is 1882. He's 27 years old.
Okay. Wow.
He has yet to write any of the things that you would know him
Of
from,
course.
okay,
Okay.
as a casual person. So what's happened here? Excellent question. He's parodied in a play because he's kind of known through London as being this, like, beautiful, aesthetic dandy with no substance. He's kind of like in the play lampooned as a buffoon. Well, this play gets picked up by Gilbert and Sullivan, and they decide they're going to make an operetta of it. Okay, fine, but Gilbert and Sullivan are operating in America, and their producer goes, "This nobody knows who this is making fun of. We have to bring Oscar Wilde here, tour him through the country, so people know who this comedic character is that they're laughing at."
This is some next level marketing.
Right?
Wow. This is a real like viral marketing way ahead of its time. This is wow. That's a
So what's crazy about this is Oscar Wilde is also at next level marketing because he goes, "Yeah, absolutely, I'll do that." Because he's 27 and he's been asked to come to America to speak 150 times. He's like, "Sign me up." Right? Wilde does not have a high opinion of America, as one
okay.
might imagine. he has a lot of sideways, tongue-in-cheek things to say. Here's a quote
Hmm.
for you. America is the only country that went from barbarism to decadence without civilization in between.
Huh.
Yeah. So
Okay.
he doesn't
So
have a high opinion of it. And of course, certainly America is not ready to have a high opinion of him. Right. He's a
yeah.
dandy, America, while living in the same age as what's happening in the UK, experiences the Victorian era pretty differently than the UK does, right? They're not prepared for this aristocratic-like figure, because he's not actually an
Yeah.
aristocrat, to show up in his fine jackets. In fact, I'm gonna quickly just share a picture with you of Oscar at this age, so
All
you
right.
can
Let's
tell
see.
me if he looks to you like someone that people would have a high opinion of. Here he is. Make it a little bigger.
Yeah. So we're seeing him looking. He's got this very elaborate jacket on with these. I guess some kind of like fur, large
Mhm.
fur collar and sleeves. He's holding a walking stick. He's kind of. Um, he's got. Uh, he's. I'm not quite hunched over on this chair, but like
He's like in
kind of
that thinker
casual. But he's giving
position.
us this deep,
Yeah.
thoughtful stare. He looks like someone who enjoys sitting around thinking about and philosophize. Uh,
Got a huge gaudy ring on, I think it's
yeah,
and
yeah,
he's holding a cane, like a walking stick kind of
yeah.
thing,
So
like almost
yeah,
a scepter.
he looks like a dandy and someone who would try and approach you and talk about the aesthetics of whatnot or Greek philosophy, and you just kind of I don't know.
Yeah, he doesn't look like
Yeah,
someone who, like, 1800s America is gonna be super psyched to meet, right?
yeah, yeah.
Especially not, like, the working class folks, right?
No, no, no.
So here's what's crazy. It goes really well.
Okay.
Oscar winds up really liking America, and people really like him.
Hmm.
He's surprisingly good. He's a very good marketer. He's really good at meeting people where they are,
Yeah.
and he's a good listener.
Okay.
He asks a lot of questions,
Okay.
and he is not afraid to talk to working class people because remember, even though he looks like an aristocrat, he's a middle income person. His
Okay.
parents, while they were kind of big in Dublin society, they don't his father does not become a lord until quite further on in his career. And he kind of was exposed to a lot of different people growing up. And he's just kind of an open person and he's got a lot of curiosity. And my favorite story of this, so he meets with a lot of people who are just working class folks. And at one point, he goes down a mine shaft. I mean, you saw what he was wearing.
Yeah, yeah.
He goes down a mine shaft and he has this like kind of unstructured conversation with the miners at the bottom of the mine shaft. He's down there for like an hour and a half. When he
Wow.
comes back, he said, we laughed and they thought I was very funny. They gave me a lot of applause when I was done, and we had a great time with each other.
Hmm. So charming guy.
Yeah, so this local newspaper in Arizona says, "We can recall nothing to ridicule even though we were so disposed."
Hmm.
Like they go into his
Yeah.
hotel room waiting to make fun of him, and they like laughed and they're like, "Nah, actually he's pretty great." We had a good
Yeah.
time.
And there's a good one liner from him.
Right.
Yeah.
And to tie into that, so like about how Oscar was getting very savvy and very smart. He's like an influencer. He's just really got his finger on the pulse. He really wants to meet Walt Whitman.
Okay.
So I'm gonna it's so many literary names in
Yeah,
this.
I was gonna say there's that Venn diagram again.
Right, exactly. It's kind of amazing he doesn't run into Dumas. If only they'd lived at the same time, they would have loved each other. Speaking of
Yeah.
the throwback, I think they would have really gotten a crack at it. But so he wants to meet Whitman. Whitman's in his 60s and he recently had a stroke, so he doesn't really want to meet with anybody. So Oscar goes, "This guy is like me. I bet if I apply to his vanity, he'll want to meet with me." Because the press is kind of referring to Wilde as because he's written right now is like poems and newspaper articles, right? As kind of like the inheritor, like the descendant of Whitman, like he's the next Whitman. And Wilde said that's not going to win him over. So he gives an interview where he's extremely flattering to Whitman. And when like the reporter asks, or like, "Are you Whitman's descendant?" He's like, "No, I'm nothing like him. He's like in a class by himself. I wouldn't even aspire. I aspire to be, but could not." So Whitman, of course, reads this and he's like, "All right, I'll meet with him." And because they're both very smart, they meet without reporters
Oh, okay.
and they meet for 2 hours. So the only word we have about this meeting is from the two of them. But what
Mhm.
this allowed them to do is both give separate interviews about the meeting afterwards.
Yeah.
They both get equal press, and they can both control what they talked about and what's said about them. Um, Whitman, by all accounts, had a great time. Really enjoyed his company. Again, did not expect to, and wound up really enjoying him. And of course, Oscar was like over the moon because he really wanted to meet Whitman.
Yeah.
So that's his tour of America. He's not famous yet, which I think is
Yeah.
crazy. He kind of gets famous through this tour partially. Certainly when he leaves America, a lot of people know his name.
Okay.
So he comes home and he is reintroduced to Constance Lloyd, who he had met 4 years earlier. She's the daughter of a barrister, again, very middle class. She's smart, she's forward thinking, and she writes her own book of children's stories at one point. They get married pretty quickly. Like they meet again within a couple of months, they're married. Again, pretty typical, right? And this is May of 1884.
Okay.
And it seems like the marriage started off great, as far as we can tell. Everyone seems happy. Oscar Wilde's really supportive of Constance because she's publishing stuff on dress reform for women, being able to have more latitude in dress and other equity acts. And he's like behind her. She seems to have helped him edit a lot of his early work.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
and they have two boys. They have Cyril in 1885 and Vivian in 1886. And I must tell you, Vivian is spelled Vyvyan.
Okay.
I, I just looked at that so many times to make sure it was correct. So I have to share that. Oscar takes over a magazine because one of the reasons he may have been motivated to marry Constance is she has 250 pounds a year, which is a
Okay.
pretty decent sum to live off of, but it's not enough because they are both trendsetters and they have to have their home in England look as nice as possible, right? Like they have to really be perfect. So they're always living a little above their means.
Okay.
He picks up this failing magazine, Ladies' World, and he starts writing for it and kind of running it at this point. So after their second child, it's unclear on what happens to break it, whether the marriage broke down first or whether this happens first. Oscar Wilde meets Robert Ross, and like Willie, he's known as Robbie. Robbie's an important guy in Oscar's life. They are friends for the rest of Oscar's life, most constant friend that he has. But that's not how they meet. They meet as lovers.
Okay.
Okay. And Ross is only 17 years old. So make
Okay.
of that what you will. By
Yeah.
all accounts, Ross is the one who pursues this love affair. He was interested in Wilde and pursued him pretty doggedly. It is the first evidence we have of Oscar Wilde indulging in same-sex relationships. It seems like Robbie was the first one, but we don't know
Okay.
that for sure. It'll come out later that he was probably doing stuff in college as well, but this is the first one on record. And Robbie is a really interesting guy because he is out about his sexuality. He's
Okay.
refuses to hide. He was bullied out of college because of it, literally beaten many
Yeah.
times. He is out to his parents who no longer speak to him. But you can
Okay.
imagine in late 1800s when
Yeah.
the sodomy laws are becoming more tight and
Yeah.
he's won't hide who he is.
Yeah. It's probably very tough.
Yeah, pretty brave. And he's a pretty well-regarded he becomes a well-regarded reporter in his own right. He's pretty good at his job.
Okay.
He lives with them for a while. Like he's even moved in to their
Okay.
house.
Yeah.
No record on what Constance thinks of that.
Yeah.
I assume she has some objections.
Yeah. Yeah. You can see where this could put a strain. Yeah.
I think there is a biography out there of Constance. I did not pick it up for this talk or for this podcast, but I'd be interested to read it because
Hmm.
the poor woman. Um, so during this time, Wilde's writing essays and short stories, but in 1890, he finally publishes The Picture of Dorian Gray. It's his only novel, by the way.
Oh, okay.
He writes a ton of short stories, but it's his only independently published novel. It did start as a magazine story.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
do you remember the premise of Dorian Gray?
Um, there's it's like a trade for one of those well, here's the deal, the you're not going to age, or the angels want to wear my red shoes kind of thing, right? Like kind of
Very that. So yeah, essentially, it's a very simple premise. There's a very beautiful youth named Dorian Gray,
okay.
and this painter named Basil paints his portrait. And Dorian laments that he will grow old and the portrait gets to stay young. And by some mechanism, it's not really, I think, made super explicit. This gets switched, and Dorian gets to stay forever young looking, and the portrait ages. But because of Victorian morals at the time, um, doing sinful things they thought would make you ugly, right? Like you wear, very Jekyll and Hyde, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So the picture gets, as Dorian realizes he doesn't have to pay for his sins, he becomes more sinful. The portrait gets uglier and uglier. Eventually, there's a confrontation. I won't spoil the ending for you in case you decide to reread it. Here's the thing that gets left out of that rather bloodless summary. It's very clear from the beginning that Basil, as he's painting this portrait, is lusting after Dorian. And that is enough to make people ballistic. Even though Wilde revised Dorian Gray like 3 times in the process of publishing it as a book,
Still scandalous, right?
it's too scandalous. He does a line for line rewrite practically to publish it, where he like
Mm.
just removes anything that he thinks is like it all salubrious.
Yeah.
And he still gets reviews that call it nasty and nauseous.
Oh,
So bookmark that mentally.
okay.
So now he's got a book out. He's also started writing plays, but they kind of don't go anywhere. He goes to Paris in 1890 to kind of like hang out there for a while. He'd lived there briefly. He's back. He goes to Paris in 1890, and he decides to write another play inspired by the story of Salome, biblical story of Salome. This play is still produced and put on today, but at the time, it didn't get performed for another 6 years.
Okay. So
So that one is not yet successful. Okay. But he finally finds his groove because what is he good at? Which is like satirical commentary on society, right? As a
yeah.
kind of comedic figure. So he writes Lady Windermere's Fan. It's performed in 1892. And it's so successful that he makes the modern equivalent of $1 million off of it.
Whoa. Okay. So there's big windfall.
Right. And then right off of that, he writes A Woman of No Importance, An Ideal Husband, and then the big one that probably everyone recognizes the most, The Importance of Being Earnest.
Okay.
All of these plays are comedies of manners, kind of lampooning the tradition, the society of the time, while also kind of honoring them. The Importance of Being Earnest is probably the best one, in my opinion. If you want to just watch one, there's a really good Colin Firth adaptation that came out in
Oh, okay.
2002. And the whole thing, The Importance of Being Earnest, is not about the moral quality of being earnest, but that women, for some reason, have come to decide that the name Ernest is a great name to marry. You want to marry a guy named Ernest, so these guys start lying about their first names so that they can secure their desired brides. So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. So he's very successful. He's making money. While all this is going on, he has taken a new lover.
Okay.
This guy's name is Lord Alfred Douglas, but he is known, because they all have a nickname, as Boise, which apparently comes from his mom calling him boyish.
No, like Alfie or
Nope.
okay.
He's not
Okay.
I'm about to tell you about a guy who could never be called Alfie. This is a
Okay.
Boise. He's the third son of John Douglas, who's the Marquis, or I remember how to pronounce it, Marquis, the ninth Marquis of Queensberry. And if that sounds at all familiar to you, do you know what the rules of Queensberry are? Does that strike anything for you?
The rules of Queensberry.
Queensberry
Uh,
rules, I think they're actually referred to.
sorry, what was that?
Queensberry rules.
Queensberry rules. I don't know. Is that like golf or tennis rules or
You're
something?
so close, it's boxing.
Oh, okay, okay. I was gonna say
So
like you know.
that's Boise's dad is like the modern renaissance of boxing guys. Okay.
Okay.
That's the
No,
kind of
well,
dude we're talking
yeah,
about.
that's a very like very Victorian era, right? We're gonna take
Right.
these, things, we're gonna codify them, and we're gonna standardize them, and yes, then we're gonna
But
have
also like hyper
our
masculine, right?
yeah, yeah.
And he marries this woman, Sybil Montgomery, and she divorces him on grounds of adultery.
Okay.
All right. So
Okay.
this is the kind of dude that Boise's father is. Boise gets a great education, but winds up going to the same college Oscar went to at Oxford, but he drops out. He doesn't manage to get a degree. And Boise's cousin introduces him to Wilde in 1891. I think Boise's like 18, 19 years old. And they begin what can only be generously called a tempestuous relationship. They break up and get back together so many times in such a fiery way that one of their acquaintances writes a book lampooning their relationship. And it's called The Green Carnation. Now, I don't know how aware you are of early Victorian homosexual coding, But because of this book and because of Wilde's association with reincarnation, being a green carnation becomes symbolic of being gay at the time.
Okay.
Now, Wilde, I don't even think is alive when this really starts to take off. It comes a little bit later. He probably had no particular association with this flower. People, he wore it, they think, to a play opening one of his plays, and his supporters all wore a green carnation. But
Okay.
that's how that association
It's
comes
like one of
about.
those things where the myth almost becomes like supersede or surpasses what it even was, in Wilde's own lifetime.
Exactly, exactly. Boise himself is a poet, and he coins a phrase that you may have heard of in one of his
Okay.
poems that is actually often attributed incorrectly to Wilde himself. Do
Oh
you know the phrase, "the love that dare not speak its name"?
no, but I can see how it's applicable.
Yep. So, this becomes very important because Boise has no discretion.
Okay.
Boise is more flamboyant than Wilde as far as how he dresses and carries himself. He has more money,
Mm.
because he not only has his own money, but Wilde is financially supporting him. All of his vices are supported by Wilde, and Boise also gets him involved in what's kind of becoming a gay underground in Victorian England. He
Okay.
introduces him to sex workers, to clubs where people hang out, of the same persuasion, just so they can meet each other, all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And Boise loves that he's with Wilde, and he tells everybody all the time.
Okay.
Okay, because this is very cachet, right? Wilde at this point is like insanely famous, right?
Yeah.
So the Queensberry rules of boxing Marquis Marquess, as you can imagine, is not crazy about this. This is his son,
Yeah.
his heir, and he confronts them several times about, and he tells Wilde, "Leave my son alone," like a million times. The problem is, of course, Boise doesn't want to leave Wilde alone. It's not just
Yeah.
Oscar's choice at this point. At one point, Queensberry shows up to the Wilde family home, and he threatens Wilde with physical violence if he doesn't break up with Boise. And Wilde first tells the story with kind of an air of humor, but he later admits that he's really actually very shaken by it.
Mm.
And on a fateful day, February 1895, Queensberry leaves a calling card at Wilde's club. So you know something about Victorian England and clubs. Do you want to tell us what that would have meant at the time?
Um,
Do you have context for this?
I feel like that would have been, the a big social, like, that was, you weren't there to, this wasn't a casual swing, but that's making a statement, right?
Right. Especially when you leave a card that says, for Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite.
Oh,
He did spell sodomite wrong. I just feel like I have to point that out.
okay.
Um,
Right. That's a very
yeah,
big.
so
This was no casual visit. This was to make a statement.
this is to make a statement. He's basically accusing him of a felonious act in front
Yeah.
of his entire club, right? Boise wants Oscar to sue his father for libel.
Oh,
You may already see a problem with this.
yeah.
So, yeah,
Kind of, kind of hard to.
kind of hard to prove libel when you are, in fact, doing the thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Literally every single one of Oscar Wilde's friends is like, do not do this. Absolutely not. In fact, a lot of them already at this point are like, you should leave the country. Oscar won't hear of it. Boise is egging him on. Boise is at this point the love of his life. Boise gets what Boise wants. Oscar sues Queensberry for libel.
Wow.
Under the law at the time, what Queensberry has to do is prove that his accusations aren't unfounded.
Okay.
Here's another literary name for you. So, a bunch of Wilde's friends are begging him to flee to France when this comes to court.
Okay.
George Bernard Shaw is
Oh
there
wow.
and says he saw this happen. And Wilde and Boise storm out. And Wilde says to Boise, "This really shows you like who your real friends are, basically."
Mm,
And of course, the irony of this is he's leaving behind his real friends and leaving with the architect of his downfall.
yeah.
Boise is, by all accounts, not a great guy, just for the record. People call him shallow. He's self involved. I do think he genuinely loved Oscar very much,
Mm,
but he was just not a guy who should have been making these decisions.
Yeah.
um, so Queensberry hires a private detective, and they produce a bunch of witnesses. Queensberry, Wilde kind of treats this court case as like a joke. You know, he's like up there and he's like being very airy. The lawyer for Queensberry is a guy he knew in college who he knew had like a lot of bitterness towards him. So he's like,
Mm,
oh, he's just gonna treat me like terribly anyway. So Wilde's like making his one-liners. He has the audience, the jury in the palm of his hand, right? Like this is what he's good at. And finally, the opposing attorney asks him, did you kiss this particular boy while you were at Oxford? And Wilde goes, I wouldn't kiss him. He was ugly. Because he thinks he's being hilarious. This seals his fate. Because then the attorney now has an angle and he says, is that why you didn't kiss him? And Oscar realizes all is lost because he's admitted essentially that it was an aesthetic issue,
yeah.
not a gender issue.
Yeah.
Queensberry is acquitted of all charges. His friends again are like, okay, you really gotta go now. Please go to France. And his mother, the freedom fighter, Miss Speranza over here, is like, no, Oscar, stand and fight. And he listens to his mom. Look, I'm a mom, but sometimes your mom's not right. He kind of
Yeah.
seemed to have this sense of like he'd given up. Like it was almost like as soon as he lost that trial, he was just like all the fight went out of him, and he's like, "This
Mm,
might as well happen," which was wild, no,
mm.
wild of wild.
Yeah.
So we get to the second trial. Now he's going to trial for sodomy.
Okay.
Um, the jury can't reach a verdict, and they the trial ends without a verdict.
Okay.
And if it was a normal trial, a normal person, that probably would have been the end of it. Again, all of his friends are like, okay, you've been given a second chance. It's time to go now.
Yeah.
And like, it's time to run. Please, por favor. He doesn't.
Oh,
And the
okay.
problem is because he's so famous, these trials are in every newspaper at the time, right? You can find a million like political cartoons being drawn of this. It's the lead story in every paper. They can't back down. They have to go to a second trial.
Okay.
Case is too big. They have all these witnesses. They have
Mm,
the problem is all of these sex workers that they dig up, they're complicit in the crime, right? And so they have their whole lives are at stake. So they're gonna
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And who can blame them? You know what I mean? They just
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm sure there's lots of coercion and everything, but yes, yeah. Because
yeah,
if they don't cooperate, then it's going to be a lot worse for them.
right. Yeah. You know, Wilde at least is famous.
Yeah,
No
I mean,
photos
yeah,
will
yeah. I
never
mean,
come out
he
again.
has and he has means too. These
Right.
people, they might not, and
Yeah.
yeah. So you can see how things, they're might be living on a much more, dangerous position right off the bat. So yeah.
And Boise's poem is part of the evidence. The love that
Mm,
dare not speak its name.
yeah,
And they hammer Oscar about what this means. It's obvious what it means.
yeah.
So he's convicted on May 25th of that year. This all happens in the span of about 3 months. It's very
Okay.
fast. 3 trials. There's a play turned movie called The Trials of Oscar Wilde, based on all of this. A lot of the people, I bring it up only because it does come up. A lot of the people who were testifying are teenagers against him. They were all above the age of consent at the time, which was 16. But make
Okay.
of that what you will.
Yeah.
It is worth noting. He's convicted and he is sentenced to serve 2 years in Reading Gaol, doing hard labor. So this isn't like 2 years in a white collar prison now.
Yeah.
He would have been breaking up rocks. He would have been walking up like those kind of stairs to like push down a water wheel.
Yeah.
Hard labor,
Yeah.
physically hard labor. Um, Boise doesn't really reach out to him very much. Oscar's like devastated. And the beginning of his sentence, the prison warden will not let him write. They won't give him writing implements. There's a
Mm,
change of administration in the middle, and they're like, okay, clearly this guy, it would be medicinal for him to write, like, you know. So
yeah.
they give him paper and pen, but he's not allowed to mail anything.
Okay.
So he writes this letter to Boise, And when I say this letter, it's 50,000 words long, and it
That's
gets printed. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that's some letter, yeah.
It's a letter. Um, he's allowed to take it with him when he leaves,
Okay.
and
I mean, hopefully, I mean, you spend that long on a letter, it's
right,
the least they can
and
do.
it was among his things when he dies. It gets published in 1950.
Oh, wow. Okay, so
It's titled De Profundis. Um, some of it's a love letter, some of it's just kind of talking about his general philosophy of life and beauty. Um, I really enjoyed reading it, but it is definitely like a dense work, and you can definitely feel a lot of sorrow coming through it. And it's definitely being written by someone with like a broken heart. I don't remember as being
makes
particularly
sense.
angry, but
But yeah, I could see that, being written while in prison and makes sense.
so through this, Constance changes her name and the boys' last names to
Okay.
Holland. She goes to Switzerland and never comes back. And the boys never see their father again.
Oh, wow.
She does send Wilde a little bit of money when he gets out of prison. I think it's like £2 a week,
Mm,
a little bit of meager money. He's very sick when he gets out of prison. His body is like destroyed from the labor.
mm,
He leaves from France to France as soon as he's released. He finally flees, like they'd asked him to. Um,
mm.
and he never goes back to England. So he's in France for the rest of his life.
Okay.
He once more feels the call to the Catholic Church. He applies to go on a 6-month spiritual retreat. They say no. So he never converts to Catholicism despite having a deep desire to do so. While he was in prison, there is the first hanging at Reading Gaol in like 18 years. It wasn't that common at this prison. And the guy was hung for killing his wife.
Okay.
Once he gets out of prison, the first thing Wilde does is he writes this long form poem called the Ballad of Reading Gaol, which is about this murder ostensibly. And the refrain in it is each man kills the thing he loves.
Um,
It's a pretty good poem. It's pretty long though. If you're gonna read it, it's no short.
okay.
It's an epic, and that's kind of the last major thing he writes.
Mm,
That's pretty much it. He does do some writing on prison reform. He sends letters to newspapers about prison reform.
mm,
Most of it written synonymously. And right when he moves out, he moves in with Robbie, his
okay.
old lover. Robbie takes him in. He's pretty dependent on him. And then for a few months, he's reunited with Bosie.
Oh,
Nobody's happy about this except for them. And Wilde's Constance writes him and says, "Listen, if you're going to live with him, I'm not sending you money." And Boise's family says, "And if you're living with Oscar, we're cutting you off." So they part again and they never meet again.
hmm,
Wilde begins to drink. He starts living in a hotel, like a not a very nice one.
mm,
And he was taking long walks, and then he started running into people who remembered him from before the trial. And it was so awkward and terrible that he just
mm,
decides to like not leave his rooms anymore. And he writes in the late November of 1900, he writes to Robbie and says, "I don't feel good. You've got to come. Like things are not well with me."
mm,
Robbie rushes to his side and he's holding his hand when he dies.
mm.
He dies from what they call meningitis. He does not depart without a good last line, though. One of in his waning days, it wasn't his last words, but his waning days, he looks around this horrible hotel room and he goes, either this wallpaper goes or I do." So he was an aesthetic right to the end.
Yeah.
Robbie becomes his literary executor of his
Okay.
will, and by all accounts is very ethical about it. He makes sure all the money goes to the boys. So
Okay.
they aren't using the Wilde last name. They do get all the money and royalties from his father.
Okay.
Wilde's originally buried outside of Paris, but Robbie pays for a beautiful tomb to be erected within the bounds of Paris. And Robbie has a shelf put in the tomb so that when Robbie dies in 1950, his ashes are put in the shelf because he wanted to be
Oh,
died.
wow.
I thought that was very sweet.
Yeah.
Those years later. Cyril, the oldest of the Wild boys, goes on to have a military career. He's killed by a sniper in World War One.
Okay.
Vivian studies law,
Okay.
but he's also called to serve in World War One, and he survives. He goes on to be a writer himself. He eventually writes an autobiography where he called The Son of Oscar Wilde, and he claims that he remembers his father being a very good father before his conviction.
Okay.
Vivian has one son named Merlin Holland, and this is when the timeline will collapse on you because Merlin Holland is still alive.
Oh.
He's only
Whoa.
77.
Oh, wow. Okay. This is oh,
He's
yeah, you're right, it did.
right?
Yeah.
Because
I
it
mean,
still sounds like so
w
long ago, but
yeah,
it's
I
good to
know.
remember that this was yesterday in the time.
Yeah.
And Holland, he still goes by Holland. Nobody ever changed their name back to Wilde. He still goes by Holland, but he's made his career writing books about his grandfather. He's a Wilde scholar. He's written a bunch of books about Oscar Wilde. And he's the one
Wow.
who overturns. So when Constance dies, Constance actually dies before Wilde, believe it or not. He
Oh.
outlives all of these people despite dying pretty young.
Hmm.
Um, her death is kind of like a little bit of a mysterious hole because she has this like surgery and the surgery's botched and she probably dies from the effects of the surgery, but they don't know why she got the surgery.
Hmm.
There's a lot of accusations flying around that Wilde himself died of syphilis and he had given her syphilis. Merlin Holland claims that this is not the case, and he feels that he's found pretty compelling evidence that it's not the case. You
Okay.
know, he has good reason, obviously, he's
Yeah.
motivated, but something to think about.
Hmm.
And then in 2017, the UK government pardons about 50,000 men who were convicted under anti-sodomy rules,
Okay.
including Oscar Wilde.
Okay.
And another name you may recognize, Alan Turing is also pardoned at
Oh,
that time.
yeah.
Another victim of the same sodomy rules. If you're not familiar, I know you are, Joe, but Turing was a major cryptographer in World War II. He's probably one of the major reasons the Germans were never able to take England. And Turing's story is, to me, even sadder than Oscar Wilde because he actually did live very quietly. He was very private about his sexuality. He did not
Hmm.
flaunt it. He was aware of the dangers, and his house was robbed. So he called the police, and the police discovered evidence of his private life in his home.
Hmm.
He was convicted and he was given the choice of going to prison or taking chemical castration. He chose chemical castration
Hmm.
and he commits suicide pretty shortly
Yeah.
thereafter. And he's one of the last really famous victims of these anti sodomy laws,
Hmm.
but certainly Wilde and him are the two most famous, arguably,
Yeah.
even though they're 50 years apart in the consequences.
Hmm.
It's pretty telling how many men are pardoned under that.
Yeah.
And yeah. I don't know if that ending surprises you because it seemed like you didn't maybe have an idea of Wilde's life there, so
I knew it didn't end the greatest. But yeah, I kept on thinking he did go to. I thought, I said, oh, was it exile? Was it self-imposed exile? Um, yeah, but a very definitely tumultuous life, a lot of highs and lows.
and a ton of impact.
Oh yeah, of course,
I
yeah.
mean, Wilde is held up in literary worlds and LGBTQIA plus spaces, you know, there's a lot to talk about with him, and I think one of the most interesting things to me is how we've traveled far and yet not all that far.
That's true in a lot of ways. Yeah.
And Stephen Fry played Oscar Wilde in a biopic about him, I think in about 2005. Jude Law plays Boise. It's a great movie. I recommend it if you're at all interested in Wilde's life. But um, Stephen Fry is kind of like a modern Oscar Wilde. He's this writer, actor.
Yeah, that's a yeah that's a good comparison there. I think. Yeah.
He plays him very well, but it's also just like, and Fry can just kind of live his life, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and we're talking a matter of 100 years, how much things changed, and really
Yeah.
less because Turing is 1950, I think.
Yeah.
So, it's a very strange thing, but there is a beautiful statue across from his childhood home in Dublin, which I found accidentally when I was there on my honeymoon. I had no idea it was
Oh.
there. It was on the same block as my hotel. We just went out for a walk
Ooh.
because we were like super jet lagged. And it's interesting because it's one of these statues, it's actually in full color, which is
Oh
pretty
wow.
unusual. So just as a last moment here with Wild, I'll share that picture with you.
Oh, there he is. Oh, he's kind of. It's I guess on a on like a big rock or boulder, and
It's
he's
a huge rock. Yeah, it's like
yeah,
10
okay,
feet tall.
and there he is, kind of. lounging, giving us like I guess a knowing smirk or smile, I'd say.
Yeah,
Um,
and he's in
yeah,
this, like, green and pink jacket, right?
yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, he's very very like very much the dandy, just kind of relaxing and yeah, just hanging out on this rock on this big boulder.
And yeah, he's facing the home he grew up in Dublin. So
Yeah.
Ireland very much claims him as one of theirs, as they should. He is an Irish
Mhm.
author.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's the story I wanted to share about Oscar Wilde, who had quite the life, um, quite the strange and and short life,
Yeah.
even though
Yeah.
he outlived most of his family.
Yeah, and that's the funny part that right, all things relatively speaking, yeah, he did last longer than a lot of them. Yeah. Well, thank you. That was really fun, and I always like like I said, this was like a total blind spot. For as much of like oh yeah, I always enjoy the classics. This was a big blind spot for me. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Well, thanks for letting me ramble about Wilde. I do love him for his all his ups and downs. I thought he's a fascinating guy, and that's without even talking about his literature, really,
Yeah.
is this whole other thing. But like I said, next episode, hopefully, we'll be talking about some music videos, which I'm excited for. We'll have links galore for that one, so you can follow
Yeah.
along with us. And I will sit more quietly and let Joe show me fun things, which I'm excited for. But I'll say thanks as always for joining me, Joe, and thanks to you, listener, and read on.